Venetian glassmaking was at the epicenter of this industrial transformation in Venice. During the Middle Ages, the Murano Venetian glass industry developed and diversified its production. In the early modern period, Venetian glass became world famous for its high quality, offering exquisite artifacts to satisfy the demand of elite consumers in European and Mediterranean markets. However, it continued to produce ordinary glass objects for both internal and external markets. In the 17th century, two complementary phenomena affected the Venetian glass industry. Craftsmen migration spread technological knowledge and production secrets to different European countries, while powerful glass industry, sometimes subsidized by the state within the broader framework of mercantilist policies, rose in France, England, and Bohemia. Thanks to imitation and innovation, these new competitors succeeded in surpassing the Venetian glass industry in several segments of production, ultimately expelling them from the market. This was particularly evident in the case of large mirrors, where the Venetians could not compete with the French, as they were globally unable to replicate the casting technique invented by Bernard Perrault. To survive, Venetians were pushed to specialize their production in market niches where their relative advantages remained competitive. So it was in this context that glass bead production in Venice began to grow significantly, reaching its peak in the 18th century when the bead sector employed more than 1,000 workers and exported over 500 tons of beads annually. An essential stimulus came from the Atlantic markets, where the slave trade had begun to expand in order to supply cheap labor for sugarcane plantations in the Americas. Especially in the 18th century, hundreds of tons of glass beads left Rialto each year to fill the cargo holds of Dutch, English, French, and Portuguese slave ships. However, glass bead production existed in Venice well before the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. Some early examples of glass imitating precious stones and rosary beads date back to the 14th century. In the 15th and 16th centuries, glass beads were exported to the Levant and North Africa, and they were also included in the cargoes of the first European voyages along the western coast of Africa. Meanwhile, labor organization underwent a process of specialization. In Venice, glassmaking was always organized in guilds known as arti. And over time, product specialization was mirrored by a parallel phenomenon of guild formation. From the core of the mother guild of Murano, craftsmen sought the Venetian government's permission to form autonomous guilds that would monopolize the production of specific products, such as mirrors or beads. The latter were originally produced by the art of Cristalleri, which later became known as art of Cristalleri and Paternostreri. In the mid-17th century, technical specialization led to a new division within the Paternostreri Guild. A group of craftsmen demanded and were granted the privilege to form a new guild called the Art of Suppialume, which produced lamp beads. In the 18th century, the production of glass beads in Venice was carried out by three guilds: the art of Murano, the art of Margheriteri, and the art of Berleri. This system facilitated the fabrication of a wide range of beads, from small monochrome beads to semi-precious objects such as corniole, for example, beads imitating carnelian, or silver beads. The guilds managed most aspects of bead manufacturing and sought to extend their control over the supply of certain raw materials, such as silicon sand, manganese, and soda ashes. While the owners of the ovens and merchants of Margheriteri and Berleri guilds handled the wholesale trade of the beads. The production process of beads in Venice in the 18th century was organized as follows. Murano's masters and furnace owners, with few exceptions, purchased the raw materials on the market, importing them from across the Mediterranean. For example, ashes were imported from Egypt, Malta, Sicily, Syria, etc. Ash could also be supplied by the merchants of Margheritieri and Perleri as a part of a regulated internal trade. Then craft workers in Murano transformed these raw materials into glass rods and enamels in their furnaces. Then the owners of the furnaces in Murano sold the rods and enamels to the Margheritieri and Perleri merchants and oven owners. The rods were then transformed using different techniques by craftsmen and external workforce, including women as well as children. The Margheritieri transformed pierced rods into seed beads called colterie by cutting them into small sections, which were then rounded in ovens using copper basins or skewers. Perleri shaped their beads by melting large glass rods with the flame of a torch, lume in Italia, hence the term perle a lume or manifatture a lume. So in this case, glass drops were dropped onto a refractory thin thread, forming a bead that was rounded and decorated with enamels. And beads were generally strung on threads and in bunches, used also in necklace, but less often, by hundreds of unofficial female workers. After being decorated with bows and ribbons, the threads were delivered to merchants of Margheritieri and Perleri, who could then sell them to general merchants in Venice or export them according to orders from their clients in Mediterranean ports. The presence of 3 strictly regulated guilds, which were theoretically closed to outsiders, did not weaken the competitiveness of the sector. In recent years, extensive literature has shown that a significant gap existed between regulation and work practices, and that guilds were in fact flexible organization and institution that adapted in order to survive. And glass bead guilds were no exception, as already shown by Annabella Vitis, Francesca Trivellato, more recently Barbara Bettoni, and by my research also. The entire sector exploited various strategies to remain competitive in international markets. The first of these was the aforementioned gap between norms and practices. Despite prohibitions, guild owners and merchants used several strategies to make production more flexible. And this included extending working hours, paying wages through barter exchange, reducing salaries, hiring illegal workers, illegal obviously, such as women, children, and immigrants, and maintaining an illegal number of tools like torches or oven, among other tactics. So glass guilds also introduced labor-saving innovation in raw material transformation and chemical innovations in the fabrication of semi-finished product. Additionally, despite prohibition and harsh penalties, the sector was quite open to internal cooperation between members of different glass guilds for financial purposes, as well as to external intervention. For example, in many cases, Venetian Jewish merchants became intermediaries between the market and production, supplying raw materials, buying beads, or directly investing in bead production by commissioning craftsmen. So it was through these various strategies that the Venetian glass bead sector remained competitive and flexible enough to cope with the volatility of early modern international trade. And concerning these, what gave significant boost to this sector was oceanic trade, particularly the Atlantic slave trade, as I already said. By the 15th and 16th centuries, beads, when beads were already exported to the Levant and North Africa, the Portuguese began bringing them to West Africa. And soon the Spanish, French, Dutch, and English joined this trade, spreading Venetian beads to the Americas as well. However, it was in the second half of the 17th century that bead exports grew significantly, following the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade. The spread of sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean dramatically increased the demand for forced labor, and by the 18th century, beads made in Venice had reached most part of the world, from Hudson Bay to Bengal, from Persia to Brazil, and here in nearly all of Africa. And indeed, Africa was the destination for most of the beads produced in Venice in the 18th century. The expansion of this industry in the 18th century was characterized by a rise in orders and the widening also of markets, two phenomena well understood by producers. In 1745, for example, Margariteri wrote to Venetian censori, a magistracy that supervised glass guilds, among others, that in fact, and I quote, compared to earlier times, today's commissions have at least doubled. While in the past, only Egypt demanded conterie, which were sent to the East Indies through maritime traffic in the Red Sea, today the consumption of conterie has expanded to North Africa and to the vast and populated western and southern provinces of America, where they are shipped by the English, Spanish, French, and other nations. These commissions are so abundant and simultaneous that the current number of workers is inadequate. So in the 18th century, Venetian glass bead trade was structured around two major markets, one in the west and the other in the east, with secondary, though important routes extending to the Balkans and probably further in Eastern Europe, the German-speaking world, and the Maghreb. Venetians primarily shipped their beads to the Ponent, to Atlantic ports like Cadiz, Lisbon, London, and Liverpool, and to the Levant, mainly to Alexandria in Egypt and Alexandretta, the port of Aleppo. While the Western circuit is well known, since Venetian beads were involved in the transatlantic slave trade and in the colonial trade, the Eastern circuit is less studied. The Ottoman Empire played a crucial role in Venetian bead trade. Indeed, as a whole, the Levant remained a cornerstone of Venetian trade throughout the 18th century. Despite fierce competition from other European merchant powers such as France, England, and the United Provinces, Venice continued to be a key player in the Mediterranean trade within the Ottoman Empire. Venetian ships participated in the maritime caravan between the empire's ports, while several consuls alongside the Bailo in Constantinople represented the Republic in Ottoman ports and cities. They supported Venetian merchants active in the capital, in Salonika, in Smyrna, in Aleppo, Cairo, and elsewhere. Venetian manufactured goods were also exported throughout the empire in exchange for coffee, for cotton, drugs, spicy, and other raw materials that were produced in the empire or imported from Asia. In addition to high-quality wool and silk fabrics, glass objects were vital export goods that Venetian merchants continued to sell in the Ottoman Empire for customers of the empire, but also for re-export them towards Asia and Africa. And for example, in 1762, glass beads accounted for 15% of Venetian exports to Egypt. And this figure surpassed 30% in Venetian trade with Aleppo during the 1780s. Aleppo and especially Cairo were the two key nodes that redistributed Venetian beads to their African and Asian destinations. In Cairo, traders redirected beads to the Arabian Peninsula and Sudan, the broader Sudanese region. The route to Jeddah was a vital commercial artery for Egypt, and each year several tons of Venetian glass beads were shipped from Suez to the Hejaz coast. Most of these products were not retailed in Jeddah, but were sold to merchants and stowed in the holds of English, Arab, French, Indian, Dutch, and even Malayan ships that crossed the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. These intermediaries carried Venetian beads to other middlemen and consumers in Gujarat, the Malabar coast, Bengal, and likely the Indonesian archipelago. A significant portion of the Venetian beads shipped to the western coast of India was then re-exported to the eastern coast of Africa, following the crucial trade routes that linked the two continents. And in addition to maritime routes, Venetian beads also traveled by land to Darfur and Sennar, carried by African caravans arriving in Cairo. These convoys transported and resold the Venetian beads to a vast region, possibly, though it's complicated, stretching from Chad to Ethiopia, thus spreading them into the inner regions of Eastern and Central Africa. From Aleppo, beads were sent by caravan to Armenia, Baghdad, Persia, and especially Basra, the hub that connected Syria and Mesopotamia to the Indian subcontinent. Although Persian trade flourished in peacetime, and despite some examples found along the east coast of the Arabian Peninsula, most Venetian glass beads transshipped at Aleppo in the 18th century were directed to Basra, and from there to Surat, Mumbai, and Bengal. Once again, it is highly likely that a significant portion of these beads found their way eventually to Eastern African ports. But what is important to highlight here is that in the 18th century, hundreds of tons of Venetian glass beads circulated by both land and sea through the Levant, North Africa, and the Indian Ocean, ultimately reaching consumers in South Asia and East Africa. As a result, for the Venetian glass bead industry, these routes and markets were just as crucial as those in the West that connected the lagoon with the Atlantic. In both cases, producers and merchants of one of the main industrial sectors in Venice relied on the demand from distant consumers, most of whom were located in Africa. So during the 18th century, Venetians had to adapt their production to meet the preferences of these far-flung consumers, which led to the diversification and sophistication of bead offerings in Europe. And it's complicated, but Venetian bead producers and merchants understood that their sector was deeply dependent on foreign commissions, which carried specific demands for bead models requested by consumers in Africa, the Americas, or Asia. Several documents produced by Venetian bead guilds reference this reliance on foreign consumption. As you can see from the slide, these are some quotes that I found in documents and material produced by Venetian glass bead guilds. For example, these conteries serve the needs of the farthest regions of Africa and the Indies, where they are transported by the most industrious trading nations, or to our rich and active trade, always varied and uncertain, entirely dependent on the farthest regions of Africa, Asia, and America. And the entire consumption of our products comes from abroad. So this dependence on foreign demand meant that Venetian bead makers had to adapt their production to the preferences of different consumers around the world. It is difficult to assess on a global scale whether these preferences originated entirely and directly from consumers, or whether they were the result of more complex dynamics in which the supply side, namely Venetian producers, for example, or middlemen or merchants of a charter company, contributed to shape the emergence of changing and more sophisticated demand. In this regard, Venetian glass and bead makers had a long tradition of practical experimentation grounded in centuries-old know-how, which allowed them to create new products for their buyers, both in Venice and in Euro-Mediterranean trading centers. This long-term phenomenon was encouraged by the Venetian state, which granted incentives to inventors, typically in the form of tax privileges or exclusive production rights for several years. As a result, new bead models could be produced and offered to merchants in order to maybe test the market or assembling some cargoes for this purpose. However, it is highly likely that in most cases, Venetian producers responded to specific demands from abroad. Indeed, the role non-European consumers played in shaping European production and trade dynamics during the early modern period is an important topic that research is currently and increasingly exploring, as evidenced by the Arms, Beads and Clothes project. But for example, some years ago, Anne Carlos and Frank Lewis, in a book called Commerce by a Frozen Sea, suggested that in the 8th century, Native Americans living in the vast regions surrounding Hudson Bay experienced a growth in their material culture, which influenced the volumes, qualities, and varieties of luxury goods, including beads, that the Hudson Bay Company provided them in exchange for furs. So I think that the same probably was true for the Venetian bead industry as a whole in the 18th century. And primary sources suggest that Venetian bead production and trade were largely shaped by consumer demand. And since most of the beads produced in Venice in the 18th century ended up in Africa, was intended for African consumers, the preferences of African consumers played a crucial role in transforming the Venetian bead sector. And information about which types of beads to make or how to modify production reached Venice through merchant and institutional networks. Through commissions, for example, foreign merchants conveyed the preferences of African or American consumers to Venetian bead makers. For example, in 1764, Cornelio Ferrari, a Murano glassmaker, wrote to the Venetian government that his new invention, a bead called Stellaria, was the result of numerous attempts based on a specific order from his correspondent in London that traded with the Americas. And that same year, 2 Venetian merchants who traded extensively in beads informed the Venetian government that commissions from, and I quote, Portugal, England, Holland, mostly headed to the Indies, specified the precise weight of bead bunches and the number of threads in each bunch. And together with merchant networks, institutional networks were also crucial, especially in the Levant, where the Republic relied on a dense consular network. And consular dispatches from key trade centers such as Aleppo and Cairo contained valuable information about beads and about other trade goods, obviously. News about trade, caravans, prices, and defects was regularly sent to the Cinque Savie alla Mercanzia, it was the Venetian magistracy responsible for overseeing trade and economic activities, and who maintained close contact with the Venetian merchant community and guilds also. In the second half of the 18th century, for example, the Venetian consul in Aleppo repeatedly warned his superiors about defects in corniole beads and the negative impact that this had on local merchants, urging intervention from Venetian merchants and guilds. In other letters, he informed the Cinque Savi about market saturation for certain types of beads, and conversely, the strong demand for others. Less frequently, but this is interesting maybe for you, information transmitted by consuls to Venice concerned the role that beads played in African societies. One such example, and for now the only one example that I found, is the voyage of Vitaliano Donati to Egypt in 1759 and 1760. A physician and archaeologist, Donati was sent to the Levant by the King of Savoy to collect archaeological artifacts. Born in Padua, where he also studied, Donati was a Venetian subject by birth. And once in Egypt, he obtained the protection of the Venetian consul in Cairo, Giovanni Ferro, who assisted him and kept the Venetian government informed about his stay and journey. In 1760, Donati ascended the Nile, visiting several sites of interest, and arrived in Aswan, but did not proceed much further. On January 12, 1761, Ferro wrote to the Cinque Savi alla Mercanzia about Donati's return to Cairo. He noted that Donati had come safely back from Upper Egypt, delighted by many rarities, and that he would have continued his journey if he had not lacked provisions and I quote, that currency that is better to have in those regions, which is not gold or silver, but our conterie and salt. Had he been advised by those familiar with Upper Egypt, he would not have started his journey without those goods and could have satisfied his curiosity. So in the journal Donati kept during his journey, the reasons preventing him from traveling further south are not explicitly mentioned. He only referred to, and I quote, many difficulties that prevented me from passing into Nubia. However, Donati did repeatedly mention glass beads, describing how women in different regions adorn themselves with them. And moreover, the consul mention of the importance of conterie for people in Upper Egypt and Nubia indicates that he was at least partially aware of the role beads played in those African societies. This information was shared with his Venetian counterparts. Additionally, Ferro Dispatch suggested that several people in Cairo, probably merchants, were familiar with the role beads played in regions south of Egypt. And finally, Ferro's comment on conterie is significant because it confirms that glass beads were already being used as currency in those regions by at least the 18th century. So through merchant and institutional networks, information about customer preferences in terms of bead models, colors, and sizes circulated from Africa to Venice. These networks often overlapped as both merchant and institutional channels played complementary roles. For example, in Venice, warnings regarding defects or production-related issues often led to investigations by magistracies into bead guilds. And this investigation revealed that Venetian producers were responsive to customer feedback, particularly when competition with other European industries was at stake. But in the end, a continuous flow of information about the global demand for beads converged in Venice, fostering the adaptive capacity and growth of this sector. However, this demand should not be seen as a monolithic whole. On the contrary, various sources indicate that different regions expressed distinct preferences in terms of bead types and color, which could also evolve over time. in the late 17th century Margherita Charter, for example, we find articles that implicitly reference a diversified demand coming from different peoples or regions. For example, one article concerning the fabrication privileges of master craftsmen Speri over Ferrazzeri mentions the following that you can see in the slides, and I quote, "Commissions that are currently made by foreign merchants for the use of Indian peoples, and especially for the Negroes of Upper Africa, called Gelani, for whom 2/3 of the commissions are composed of Ferrazza beads, while those used by other Africans, named Mecani, are partially Spiedo and partially Ferrazza. Consular dispatches repeatedly highlight the fact that the Gelabbi or Gelani people from Abyssinia specifically requested Contaria Ferrazza mezza libra. Trade-related sources that reveal that different types of beads were shipped to different locations, though data are not systematic. For example, list of beads sent to Liverpool between 1765 and 1767 by Venetian merchant Isaac Dallaman indicate that enameled and brilliantly faceted beads were amongst the most popular products, while white, black, and burgundy red beads together accounted for about 40% of shipments. I collected and summarized data from Egypt, Tripoli, and Aleppo that can be compared in a more systematic way. Dispatches, as you can see from the Venetian consul in Cairo, provide insight into the composition of Venetian bead exports to Egypt in 1762. There's a relatively even distribution between lamp beads and conterie, but the source does not distinguish between decoration or colors for all products. What we know is that in that year, rubini of various sizes, meaning beads imitating the red of rubies made with lamp, accounted for more than half of the beads arrived in Cairo. The North African city of Tripoli was the main destination for beads trade, for Venetian bead trade in the Maghreb, serving as a key point of arrival and departure for the caravan routes that had connected the Western Sub-Sahara with the Mediterranean for centuries. And through Tripoli, Venetian beads reached the Timbuktu and Borno regions. In 1770, Consul Giuseppe Ballovich compiled a detailed list of products imported into Tripoli each year. And among the dozens of items listed, we find a lot of beads. And demand from Tripoli appears to have been heavily concentrated on conterie, which accounted for around 60% of imported beads, and especially conterie spiedo, which could be a distinctive feature of the demand arriving in Tripoli. Aleppo, as we saw earlier, played an important role of intermediary between the Mediterranean, the Levant, and the Indian Ocean. And Venetians primarily sent corniola, glass beads imitating carnelian, a red chalcedony variety. Venetians sent to Aleppo mostly corniola, and these beads were sent to Basra and then Surat. While Persia, for example, demanded, at least for a period in the 18th century, for silvered beads. And Perleri acknowledged that was a specific feature of that market. And these examples, admittedly, should be integrated with other sources for a fuller understanding. However, they suggest that different regions expressed a highly diversified demand for beads, indicating that the types of beads Venetians and or their partners sent to Aleppo would have differed from those they sent to Tripoli or to Cairo. So merchants did not send random cargoes of beads to random destinations. Rather, they carefully adapted their product offerings to meet demand. Producers and traders in Venice received specific commissions from their partners or correspondents in Cairo or Aleppo, who in turn received detailed requests for models or colors from middlemen, caravan traders, or agents. These agents then dealt with other intermediaries who ultimately reached consumers in Eastern Africa or India and were intimately familiar with their preferences. So the significant expansion of bead trade in the 18th century, combined with growing competition from other European industries and the continuous, albeit indirect, flow of information between consumer regions and production centers, fostered the development of a dynamic process of productive innovation in Venice. In other words, during the 18th century, Venetian producers expanded, adapted, and diversified their bead offerings in response to the continuous stimulus from foreign markets, most of which were located in Africa. And although both guilds were able to adapt their productions, this process was especially evident among the perleri due to the broader range of models, decoration materials that their techniques allowed them to utilize. Some years ago, Barbara Bettoni, in her book called Perle di vetro e gioie false, studied this aspect of the Venetian bead industry's evolution in the 18th century. And she suggested that the introduction of new materials, such as enamels, for example, expanded the variety of products that could be made. So from the 1740s onwards, in Bettoni's hypothesis, this led to a real explosion of new production, as shown in the Guild's official tariff list. This document outlined the products that the Guild's craftsmen could produce and their associated cost. So technically, these sources show the remuneration that Guild's merchants had to pay to craftsmen for every type of beads, not the price of beads on the market. However, costs should represent a good proxy for market prices, or at least for the value of different type of beads, in order to make a comparison. Anyway, building on Bettoni's work, I expanded the study of Perleri's bead offerings by comparing 4 different tariff lists from 1690. You can see in the slide the 1690 list, 1733, 1763 list, and 1800 list. And I conducted a general comparison for all 4 lists, while the 1763 and 1800 documents allowed for a more specific study of beads intended for the Levant and by extension for Eastern Africa. And the first element that emerges from this analysis is the growth in the number of bead types, which increased from 14 in 1690 to 816 in 1800. This growth resulted from new inventions, variations of existing types, and more detailed descriptions of beads to provide clients with a clearer picture of the available product. And as a result, the catalog expanded throughout the 18th century, particularly in the second half. The range of offerings also diversified in terms of both types and costs, hence probably price or value, creating a broad array of products from simple colored beads to more elaborate ones decorated with gold. The expansion of products was accompanied by a deeper understanding of consumer demand and its regional characteristics. Specifically, the 1763 and 1800 tariffs were organized by associating specific types of beads with specific markets. In the 1763 tariff, for example, this distribution was still fairly general, with beads grouped into 3 broad areas: the Levant, Germany, and Spain. But by 1800, the markets had become much more precise. We find Aleppo, Constantinople, the Levant and Tripoli, Lisbon, London, Holland, Spain, and even Wallachia. And as you can see from the slides, bead types intended for the Levant and largely for Eastern Africa grew from 25 in 1763 to 162 in 1800. An interesting thing is that this preliminary analysis of word frequency in the two lists of the Levant reveals some stability in aspects of consumer demand, such as the continued presence of round, olive, ruby, and white beads. However, there were also notable changes, including a decline in leaf decorations and pear-shaped models, alongside the rise of enamels, flower patterns, aventurina decoration, so decoration with glittering goldstone glass, dots, and coral type of beads. Moreover, the bead offerings expanded and diversified in terms of costs, prices, with different distributions across various markets. It appears that, for example, that from this preliminary analysis, that the average cost for producing a bunch of beads for the Levant decreased from 6 to 4 denarii per gram, while the median cost increased from 3 to nearly 4 denarii per gram. Besides these figures, overall, this data show that throughout the 18th century, Venetian bead makers expanded and adapted their production to meet the growing demand from foreign markets. Furthermore, by responding to the flow of information that converged in Venice, Venetian bead makers were able to tailor their offerings to the preferences of consumers, selecting specific beads for specific markets and adjusting their products over time. So through this complex circulation of information and knowledge along the bead commodity chain, the Venetian bead industry and trade effectively adapted to the demands of its African clients. So in conclusion, let me summarize some key points that emerged in this presentation. In the 18th century, the Venetian glass bead sector grew in response to strong demand, much of which came from Africa. Venetian glass beads circulated widely not only in Western and Central Africa, where they were brought by European and American slave traders, but also in East Africa, thanks to multiple trade routes that combine caravan transport with maritime traffic across Egypt, the Sudanese region, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. Some of these ancient routes continued to be active in the 19th century, albeit in different forms. The strong demand for Venetian beads from Africa was not uniform, but rather locally or regionally diversified. While we cannot fully explain the reason for this at the current state of research, it is likely due to preferences related to cultural, social, economic, and maybe political roles that specific types of beads played in different societies. And in this regard, it is interesting to note that as early as the 1760s, the Venetian consul in Cairo documented the use of conterie as currency in the broader yet undefined Sudanese region. Venetian producers and traders were fully aware that their industry depended on foreign demand, particularly from distant consumers who requested specific types of beads. Primary sources suggest that from the 17th to the 18th century, Venetian bead makers expanded and adapted their product offerings based on the preferences of African consumers. This information flow, facilitated by international merchant and institutional networks, along with local incentives to experiment with new types of beads, fostered an intense process of product innovation. And over time, we see an expansion and specialization of the offer, which evolved according to probably regional preferences. And this process continued into the 19th century, though in a very different institutional and economic context. Overall, in the 18th century, African consumers played a crucial role in the development of one of the most dynamic Venetian manufacturing sectors, glass beads. More than 1,000 workers and a prosperous trade sector within the Venetian economy depended on the preferences of these distant clients. Their satisfaction was essential for the survival of an industry that had to compete with others in Europe, and particularly with the Bohemian one. In the end, through their choices, Africans made significant contribution to shaping trade and driving production transformation in this European economic center. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Really wonderful presentation, very detailed and dense, that allowed us to follow the beats across regions and across, well, following several directions. And also thank you for so carefully connecting the production to the consumption, and so addressing the aim of this seminar series. I will have some questions, but I think that I will first open the floor for questions from the audience, if there are some. Please raise your hand, or just, yeah, Giacomo.
Primarily, I wanted to thank Pierre Nicolò for a truly marvelous presentation. I much enjoyed it, I have to say, and thanks also for relating your findings to our intellectual agenda. But perhaps this is an unfair question, but are you able, very briefly, of course, to carry the story forward to the 19th century? I know this is not quite your focus, but do you have a sense of how does the picture change in the 19th century? Does Venice continues to produce as much as it did in the 18th century? Do bids offering change? What about the destinations? I mean, that would, I understand that this would require a whole new paper, but perhaps you can give us a few ideas. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Giacomo, for your feedback and for your question. And I think also here in the room there's Alessandro De Cola, who is working on this topic on 19th century Venetian glass bead trade. So if you want to interrupt me or add something, please, Alessandro, feel free to do it. I'm not a specialist of the 19th century, but I can highlight some points. I mean, obviously, the institutional, political, economic context in Venice changed enormously after the fall of the Republic. Venice went from being the main port of the Republic, so covered and protected by trade privileges, manufacturing privileges, guilds system that enabled the Venetian society to, in certain terms, survive. The city passed to be one of the ports of the Austrian Empire in the long term, passing through different occupation, different legislation, different institutional framework with the French occupation, etc., etc. So the first decades of the 19th century were very complicated for the Venetian economy. For now, and I don't know if Alessandro found something, but there's no data on trade for the first years of the 19th century. So with the statistical data from the 18th century, we arrive more or less to the last years of the 18th century. Then there's a break, and then we have some figures for the maybe the 1810, the first decades of the 19th century, which show the continuation of this trade and the expansion, the further expansion of this trade in the 19th century. So in a new context, with also the elimination of guild system, the concentration of production in Murano, especially for conterie, so little seed beads, and maybe with some industrial technical changes with, for example, the implementation of gas instead of fat in the production system of beads. This led to an expansion in the long run in terms of volumes of quantity of beads export. So in the long run, Venetian bead trade continued to grow well until the 20th century, I think. However, in terms of value, that I think it's more complicated. I mean, because we have some data, some figures about the value in lire of Venetian conterie export, for example, but it's more complicated, I think, to put that in the broader context of Venetian economy, maybe because of the characteristic of the data, of the figures, compared to the 18th century one, which were structured around the Venetian, the city of Venice industrial system. And I conclude about talking about destination. And here again, Alessandro, please interrupt me or correct me. But the great change in the 19th century with the suppression, the elimination of the transatlantic slave trade was the convergence, the concentration of the trade on Eastern Africa, and here again also Karin have wrote about it. So maybe there was a change. We have some figures, some statistical data, but yeah, in the 19th century, I think that a lot of beads were continued to be exported in Western Africa, but especially in Eastern Africa, so Mozambique, Zimbabwe region, Kenya also, I think. Something was exported, obviously, to the Americas and also to Sumatra, Java, and the Indonesian archipelago. But it's not a very detailed picture, I mean.
No, thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Giorgio, and if you can perhaps very briefly introduce yourself when you make questions, so that we start to know each other. Yeah.
Okay. Hi to everybody. I'm one of the postdoc researchers of this project, and I worked on the section on cloth with Professor Massimo Zaccaria of the University of Pavia, even though now my contract has ended, and I'm working now in Germany, and I'm an early modernist as a let's say background. And the fact that I'm an early modernist also means that I was very much interested in your presentation. Thanks. I really liked it. Extremely informative. I had two questions. One which is, let's say, more general, and one more specific on a specific slide. The more general is, let's say, which part of the flow of beads is actually controlled by people based in Venice. I got the impression that what you meant was that in the Levant and Libyan trade, so to say, that the trade was terminal is in Tripoli, it's Venetian merchants who deal with the, let's say, transport and who own the beads while they move them from Venice to Cairo or Tripoli. And then sold somewhere else. Whereas for the Atlantic trade, basically it's foreign merchants who buy the beads directly in Venice and then ship them to London or Cadiz. But I don't know if that's correct or maybe if that's a bit more nuanced. And then the other question was on one of the slides, of the first slides, with the numbers of exports to different regions of Europe. The one with smaller. No, with
This one?
the one before. The one before. No, it is. No, sorry, this one.
This one with a round. Okay.
Yeah, I think it was this one. Yeah, in which there's this larger export to Istria, which I don't know if it's in scale, but it appears almost as much as Alex.
Yeah, it's scale.
What's that supposed to be? Is it a smuggling trade to the Austrian Empire or what?
Okay, thank you very much, Giorgio, for your feedback and your questions. I will start with the second one, which is more specific. Even though I do not know if I can answer you, because we have in the time series of Venetian data about glass bead trade, this huge export flow to Istria. Okay, the category in the source is Istria, and I didn't know why. I tried to check in sources from representative of Venetian power, of Venetian state in Istria, and looking for some smuggling towards Trieste, for example, or towards Fiume, or towards Ancona, the free ports in the Adriatic Sea. And I found something, but nothing compared to the dimension of this great circle here in the map. So the hypotheses are two. The first one, yes, there was probably a smuggling trade, contraband, maybe some ships that, because this could be related to the pilotaggio or navigation system between Istria and Venice. Ships arrived from Lisbon, Liverpool, or Alexandria in Istria, and then there they had to hire pilots to go inside the lagoon. So maybe there was some sort of smuggling or activities between the lines of the regulation. So beads were transshipped in Parenzo or some other ports in Istria to these ships from the Levant or from the Ponent. I don't know. I didn't find evidence supporting this hypothesis. The other one is clearly smuggling on little ships to Trieste or to I don't know, Fiume, for example. And I found something about this. And the third one is more interesting and is connected with an evidence that I showed in the slides about Wallachia. There's a lot of beads in the tariff list intended for Wallachia, so broader Eastern Europe region. And in other Venetian sources, we have a lot of evidence about merchants from Romania or Wallachia or those regions between the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian Empire, and also from Moldavia, Bessarabia, or those regions that using the river system of the Danube and the river system in the Balkans arrived in Split, in Spalator, or even in Istria. From there, bringing their trade goods, and asked for silk, textiles especially, and also glass. So my take is, yes, some smuggling, some transshipments, etc., but a lot of beads went also towards Eastern Europe. Why? I don't know. I didn't find the answer yet, but I think this is a very interesting research path, because no one currently, usually associates beads to Eastern Europe. If someone here has some clues, I would very, very, very interested in this. And sorry, concerning the first question, which is rather broad, but very interesting, because yes, I didn't have the time to specify it. Yes, you are mostly correct. There was a sort of two situation, two situations between the Levant and the Ponent. There was a very different setting and very different merchant networks that traded beads in the Levant and in the Atlantic context. Venetians, as you know, maybe had very few merchant houses in Lisbon, in Cadiz, in London or Bristol or Liverpool or Amsterdam in the 18th century. There were consuls in these ports. There were some merchants, maybe some agents, but as a whole, the presence of Venetian merchant houses in the Atlantic context was not comparable with the presence in the Levant. So in the Atlantic context, Venetian, the typical situation, especially in the second half of the century, for which I have a lot of data coming from ship manifests, so the document that listed cargoes with shipper and receivers. We have Venetian. We had merchants from the guilds, so Margariteri and Perleri merchants, with partially sent beads to intermediaries in Genoa, for example, or maybe in Livorno, where English merchant houses and slave traders as branches or agents or stuff like that. Or we had bigger merchant entrepreneurs, Venetian merchant entrepreneurs of the guilds that traded directly and established contact directly with great Lisbon, for example, slave traders, with great Liverpool slave traders like the William Davenport and company, through Livorno merchant networks. So Venetians were not directly involved in the trade of beads in the Atlantic. They shipped the beads to Lisbon, to Liverpool, in exchange for sugar, for cocoa, for other exotic goods. And then we had general merchants in Venice. General merchants, so they were not part of the guilds, so they theoretically could not access directly to production, to craftsmen, but had to pass through the intermediation of guild merchants. And also these general merchants in Venice had to ship their beads to middlemen and much more important merchant in Lisbon and Liverpool. In North Africa, in Tripoli, for example, Tripoli was rather a specific context in which there were a lot of Venetian Jewish merchant, both from Venice, Venetian Jewish merchant and Tuscan Jewish merchant, which collaborated with Venetian. So there were a complicated network and with branches of houses from Livorno, for example, or branches from Venice that traded in Tripoli. In Alexandria and Cairo, especially, there were several Venetian merchant houses, branches of Venetian merchant houses that were there since the 17th century. So there was a continuous, as showed by Vera Constantini and Soraya Farocchi, a continuity in Venetian mercantile presence in Syria, in the Ottoman Empire in general. So in the Levant, there was often the main merchant house in Venice that shipped Conterier or glass beads to its branch in Cairo. And then in Cairo, as you know, there were middlemen, the middlemen that traded between European merchant houses and Ottoman merchants that then send beads to Jeddah or the Red Sea, etc. And in Aleppo, there was another specific situation with a lot of Sephardi Jews that controlled the Venetian trade in that city. So there was a sort of patchwork, but in general, in the Levant, the Venetian traded directly with Ottoman merchants, and in the Atlantic, they sent beads from Venice to Portuguese or French or English traders. Sorry, but I had to fix.
No, sure.
Thank you, Pierre. And now I think we can collect two questions, Massimos and Alessandro's.
Yes, thank you. Massimo Zaccaria, University of Pavia, the third unit within this project. And I liked very much your presentation, and I have a question about producer, no? Because as you presented, no, Venice, of course, was the center of this production. And then there were other competitors from Europe. But then in your presentation, Cairo, for example, was a very important point, no? But you present Cairo as a transit point for beads to be shipped to Jeddah, Libya, Sudan, Sub-Saharan Africa. But I was wondering if also Cairo or the Ottoman Empire was able to produce beads, no, because they had a very long tradition in working glass, no, and so my question is, do we have also a production in this area, and was this production competing with the Western European production?
Thank you very much.
Yes, and perhaps Pierre, we collect two questions. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much, Pierre, for your wonderful presentation, and it is a pleasure to meet you again. I'm Alessandro De Cola. I'm a postdoc in this project, working specifically on beads. I won't add anything to your answer. I can give just a small a spoiler to Giacomo, saying that in the 19th century, exports of glass beads grew exponentially, sixfold, sevenfold also. I have actually a very specific questions, maybe a little bit nerdy. I have specifically regard to the slide where you talk about the different beads for different markets, and the Aleppo part of this slide. Do you know what's the difference between this corniola of 120, corniola of 140 beads, and the 280? Thanks.
Okay, can I answer now? No, Karin. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you very much, Massimo, for your feedback and question. As far as I know, no, there was no Ottoman, or I don't know, Ottoman, Syrian, because Syria was famous for glass, especially in ancient times, in antiquity and Middle Ages. But no, in the 18th century, as far as I know, and as far as I looked for, no, I didn't find evidence of Ottoman production. And what is more important, news from Venetian consuls or institutional network or Cinque Savie la Mercanzia that refer to menace from Ottoman or Levant producers. What did I find in the dispatches from Aleppo is, as other researchers already shown, is that in the 1780s, I think, there are there is news from the Venetian consul in Aleppo to Venice that there is a competitive production of beads coming from China, which is competing for the Indian market, but they use Indian market as a general indication. Venetian consul are not precise. They probably didn't know where beads eventually ended up, so they use frequently the expression of East Indies or Africa or Abyssinia in a rather general terms. So, but this is the only news about, the only evidence about Eastern competition that I found in Venetian archives. So I don't know, China or maybe some other regions in Asia. And yeah, in the 18th century, Venetians were they competed mainly with Bohemian or Southern Germany production, especially for the English market, because I found also what they in some ship manifests. I found also in a Swedish ship from Livorno some Dutch beads imported in Egypt, but it was a singular case, and I don't know if that Dutch, those beads were really Dutch or imported through Amsterdam from German areas or Bohemia, because this was very frequent in the 18th century. And sorry, for Alessandro, it's the number of beads for each thread. So 120 beads per thread, or 140 beads per thread, and 280 beads per thread. And in consular Venetian consul in Aleppo repeatedly warned Cinque Savie la Mercanzia about the fact that Venetian merchants or producers shipped these bunches with less beads that what was indicated in commission. That, for example, this was one of the problems that Cinque Savie la Mercanzia had to deal with. So this sort of commercial strategies to try to make some profit from reducing the number of beads in each bunch or thread.
Thank you.
Very interesting. So we have Darlington and Julia. So we can have the two questions and then you can reply, Pierre. So Darlington first. You are muted, Darlington.
Yeah.
Hey, Pierre, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. I'm Darlington, by the way. I'm a Jacobs Fellow at the Political Science Department here at Pavia. And I'm a political analyst, so you were speaking in Latin to me, actually. So I was trying to follow what you're saying, but yeah. But then I was quite intrigued. I was listening to you, and you're talking about East African consumer demands and Venetian glass beads. And I was just trying to understand, maybe if you could explain to me maybe further how this dynamic actually challenges our conventional notions of cultural identity, and then how this dynamic illustrates the ethical, creative complexities in this early global trade. And in addition to that, if maybe you could also speak a little about cultural autonomy, because these historical exchanges, maybe if you could speak about whether there was some kind of tensions between cultural autonomy and interdependence, because I think you're talking about two very different spheres and coming together in trade, and how possibly this what maybe suggests about evolving ownership and meaning of cultural heritage in our world and our present world today. I mean, what we can learn from that historical setting in today's world, if I'm not asking something too far off from your research. So yeah.
No, just thank you very much. Just if you can repeat the word, the tension between, I didn't understand,
Oh,
sorry.
yes. So the tension between cultural autonomy and interdependence. So, because I think there's because from what I gleaned from your presentation, you're speaking about two different dispensations, and possibly how was that feeling of cultural dependence and interdependence, that exchange going on in that era of time, and what we can learn from that presently from that historical setting.
Thank you very much.
And Julia?
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Pierre, for this wonderful presentation. I have two, maybe three questions, more for the perspective of Venice in the 18th century. The first one is why you use the term illegal workers, because I think they are only foreigners, so in sources maybe stranieri. So I was wondering if maybe you could explain better why you have used this more contemporary term. And the second one is, if I have well understand, you have explained that there are some official merchant of the gilde, the Save della Mercanzia, and non-official merchant. And I was wondering if there is also the support of Muslim merchant and not only Jewish. So I think it could be also an option. And the third question is related to one of your slides and the figure when you show in the 18th century that exactly in your last graph there was in 118 the maximum of demand, so of export of glass. Okay. Of glass.
Maybe there was the first one graph.
Yeah,
It was
maybe.
the chart.
It was maybe the list with export or demand of yes, with this 180. Did you show that there is a big increasement in the export? Yeah. So I was wondering if the problem is not only that you consider the demand, but also, as you said before, probably that Venice is in the Habsburg Empire. So probably the Habsburg decide to put more emphasis on this exportation. So I'm not sure that is only the problem of the demand in this sense. But okay, it's maybe only feedback or question for you, because I don't know at all this glass bead exportation is very fascinating topic. So congratulations.
So, okay. Thank you very much, Darlington, for your feedback and question. And I don't know if if I can answer you because you pose very deep questions on which I don't know if I have the skills and the knowledge to respond. I mean, if we are talking about cultural identity link to beads, for example, I think here we have anthropologists and cultural historians that can answer well beyond my experience and knowledge. Indeed, it seems to me that beads were linked to very deep and important cultural identity in different African societies across time and space. And what is interesting studying the bead trade even in the early modern period is maybe this encounter, this meeting between different, as you said, cultural, cultural settings, or in general, different meanings attributed to objects. For example, I find very interesting this relation between beads, material culture, and value, and especially the fact that glass and beads especially are often considered as in Western civilization or Western cultural setting as jugo or objects that are worthless, with no value. And even in the 18th century, however, this worthless object gave thousands of workers the possibility to live in Venice, and a rather important port city in the Mediterranean, the possibility to continue to grow. And on the other side, the great value that beads as object, but sometimes dissociated from economic value had in African societies. So what is interesting for me is this the study, even though I am not a cultural historian, nor an anthropologist, nor a material culture expert, trying to really consider these aspects in the broader framework of my study, and so giving the right interpretation of this phenomenon, and giving beads, so a wordless object, a better place in for example in history of Mediterranean trade, of early modern European trade. And also beads, and also this question about difference of values, difference of attributions and meanings of an object, clearly, as you know better than me, I think, opened the bigger question of colonial trade, or I don't know, unequal exchange between the West, Europe, and Africa, for example. And beads are the symbol of this. Often, beads are the symbol of this unequal exchange. But I think that we, with our work, with our research, and for example, an important project like Arms, Beads and Clothes project, can contribute greatly to reshaping this idea of worthless object, of unequal exchange, highlighting the importance of that these objects played in, for example, African societies or American societies in early modern period. So giving, at least for this period, new perspective through which study the dependence question in the long run. And I don't know if I fully answer to your questions, and please you can add something if you want, but this is my perspective and my point of view on this question. And if others here, if anthropologists or cultural historians want to intervene, please feel free, because I have to learn a lot on this issue. about the questions, Julia, thank you very much for your feedback and your questions. You're right. I used the word illegal in a very maybe incorrect way. I mean, I refer to mostly to external workers that did not belong to guilds. So they were not entirely illegal workers. They were sometimes and often workers that, for example, were relatives to craftsmen or relatives of craftsmen, so that theoretically could not work for, could not produce glass beads, but were integrated in the production. So there's a complex, a very complex framework of workers that went from strangers, so immigrants, foresti, that came from Friuli, for example, and were employed in mirror production, but also for coal trituration, because coal was used in the furnaces process of conteria production. So yeah, illegal, it's not the right term to use. I had maybe external workers is better. Sure, thank you very much. So yeah, I was talking about mostly external workers, so not belonging to guilds, women that could or could not belong to guilds, because the two guilds, the Perleri and Margheriteri, had very different rules about women. For example, Margheriteri, so relatives of Margheriteri could only cut the rods and not being employed in other operations. And yes, children maybe, and strangers, so foreigners. But also, and concerning the question about merchants, official merchant of the guilds, theoretically there were, so in a very simple way, in the Margheriteri and Perleri guilds, there were full members of the guilds, so artisans that had the maestranza, so the privilege to work and to call themselves capomistri. And these capomistri could be workers or merchants / owners of ovens in the case of Margheriteri. So I use the term merchants in a more general way. So there were merchants and workers. Both were artisans or craftsmen with capomaestranza, but only merchants could sell beads, both in the wholesale trade, and so it was through them that the production of beads passed from the very protected environment of guilds to the market, so outside the guild context. So these were the official merchants that had to sell beads to Venetian merchants or to other merchants in the Mediterranean or Europe or European ports. I found a lot of Jewish merchants, some Armenian also, for example, Giovanni de Serpos and his merchant house. And there were some Muslim merchants, but very few. I think trading with Dalmatia and the Stato d'Amare in general. Spalato, for example, split some in Istria also, and also there were obviously Muslim merchants in Cairo, with which Venetian merchant traded through middlemen. And about the expansion in the 19th century, I do not have precise answer. I mean, yeah, it could be the role of demand. It could be the role of a more liberal regulation in the broader framework of the Austrian Empire, considering also that yeah, there was different legislation and tentative in an attempt to restore the Venetian industrial production in the 19th century. So yeah, probably both. It was maybe also a good political economic economic policy by the Austrian government. But as you know, a lot of historians tend to have negative opinion about Austrian rule in Veneto, in Venice. So maybe it's a topic to be discussed with more evidence that maybe Alessandro could bring to us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Pierre. If there are no other questions from the audience, I don't see hands raised. Well, I have a very brief questions that is connected to one of the topics of our project. That is on beads, that is naming beads. You have mentioned several names of beads in your presentation, and what we are studying on our side is how beads were named by the societies using them in East Africa. And I think that this is very important in terms of reconstructing the network of information that was created to pass the information from consumers to producers, and so from traders to producers, so consumers, traders, and producers. So I was just wondering if you had the chance to find information about how beads were named by the societies that use them, if they use the same names that were given to them in Venice by the producers or not.
Thank you very much, Karin, for your question. Another very tough question, very difficult question to answer. So sorry, I will skip to here. No, for now, and as far as I remember, because I employed mainly Venetian and Portuguese, English sources, French sources, and no, for now I only found European names, European or Venetian names. You can find, I don't know, ox-eyes, for example, and I don't know if ox-eyes, for example, is a name that Venetian gave those kind of beads, or for example, because of the decoration on the beads, or if this name came from the markets or from the societies that traded with Tripoli in this case, as you know, as you see here. So I don't know. I mean, I can just make speculation about it. I didn't find evidence about it.
But
I'm so sorry.
Take note.
Obviously.
Thank you. So I think that we are almost running out of time. So if there are no questions, other questions or comments, let me remind you that we will have another meeting in March on the 7th, when Felix Bram from Universität Münster will talk about European arms in pre-colonial and colonial Tanzania. And in April, we will have on the 11th, Jeremy Prestold from the University of California talking about Japanese cotton textiles in Indian Ocean, Africa. And on the 30th of April, Giorgio Riello talking about Africa and the 18th century diamond-shaped trade. And then we will have other meetings in May and June, 2 in May and 2 in June. So if you are interested to follow our seminar series, Alessandro has put in the chat our email address, the email address of the project, so that if you write us, then we can send you information and news about the project. And then we will, of course, have a final conference of the project in September, at the end of mid-September. And so, Pierre, we will have the chance to discuss glass beads again. And we will have a publication after this conference. So this presentation today will become a book chapter later on. Yeah, this will be one of the outputs of our project. So again, thank you very much, Pierre, for sharing with us your research, and thanks to all of you for attending our seminar today afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.